The year is 1944. Somewhere in the French countryside, a German hauptmann, a captain, sits in an American detention area after his unit's capture near the Falaise Pocket. He's been a soldier his entire adult life. He served in Poland in '39, France in '40, the Eastern Front in '41. He's watched the Prussian system produce the finest soldiers in Europe, men who moved with this precision of clockwork, units that obeyed and executed with a discipline no army on earth could match. And now he watches something he simply cannot process. 40 meters away, an American staff sergeant is pointing at a map pinned to a vehicle hood. Next to him, a private, is pointing at the same map and arguing, not whispering, not glancing nervously at his officer. The private is raising his voice, jabbing his finger at the paper, shaking his head, and the sergeant is listening, actually listening. And then the sergeant changes the plan. He adjusts the route. He turns to the officer standing behind him, who nods and confirms. The German captain watches all of this. He leans over to a fellow prisoner and says quietly in German, "They are not soldiers. They are a mob." He's not being dramatic. In his world, in everything he has been taught from the age of 18, this scene is not discipline. It's chaos. A private arguing with a sergeant adjusting a plan based on a private's objection. This is a breakdown of everything the military system exists to prevent. He's wrong, but he won't understand why until it's too late. Because what that German captain is watching is not a failure of discipline. It's the secret weapon. It's the thing that will end his war. And it has nothing to do with tanks or artillery or the number of divisions at the Rhine. To understand what he's actually seeing, and why the most ferocious military machine in the world couldn't figure it out, we need to go back 300 years. We need to go to Prussia. We need to understand what happens when you build a culture of perfect obedience for so long that the obedience becomes the problem. Because there is a version of this story where absolute discipline is the weapon. And there is a version where it's the cage. And the difference between those two versions is the difference between 1940 and 1944. Let's start at the beginning. Part 1. The Iron Cage. 300 years of Prussian obedience. Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, 1757. He is standing after the Battle of Rossbach, and he is furious, not at the enemy, the French and their allies, who he just destroyed in 90 minutes flat with an army half their size. He's furious at his own subordinates. His regimental commanders, some of the finest soldiers in Europe, had refused to take independent action during the engagement, twice. Moments where the initiative was there, where a commander with nerve could have broken the enemy completely, and they had stopped, looked over their shoulders, and waited for orders from above. Frederick wrote about it afterward. He said his men would not act without being told specifically what to do. He complained that his experienced colonels treated orders as sacred commands to be followed to the letter rather than as goals to be achieved through any available means. He saw what it cost him. He saw the battles that could have been decisive, crushing victories, but settled for ordinary wins because the men in the middle of the chain refused to think. Remember that observation. Frederick the Great himself saw the cage being built. He saw it clearly. And then 3 generations of Prussian military culture locked the cage back up anyway. Here is the foundation you need to understand. For nearly 300 years, the Prussian and later German military system was built on a single philosophical principle. The soldier obeys. Not because he agrees, not because he understands. He obeys because the system demands it, because the hierarchy is sacred, and because any deviation from orders, even tactically brilliant deviation, is a crime against military order. This wasn't arbitrary cruelty, there was a logic to it. In the age of muskets and line infantry, absolute obedience produced predictable results in battle. Formations that moved on command, turned on command, fired on command. A soldier who thought for himself in that context wasn't an asset. He was a gap in the line. So Prussia trained the thinking out of them, not the tactical thinking of officers. That was cultivated in the officer class with extraordinary care. But the thinking of the common soldier, that was a liability. The soldier's job was to load, aim, fire, advance, and die on schedule. His job was not to wonder why, and they built institutions to reinforce it. 16 weeks of basic training in the Wehrmacht during the years before the war included 30 parade drills per week. Not combat drills, not tactical exercises, parade drills, the repetitive mechanical conditioning of men to move their bodies on command. The ritual of obedience, performed daily until it became reflex. Officers spent almost 4 years in training, starting with 2 years in the troops, followed by rotations at infantry school and weapons school. The knowledge was extraordinary. The culture was unforgiving. A sub-leader whose first fear was being lectured by his superior could not bring himself to do anything else with orders than execute them to the letter. Now here is the part that historians often skip because it complicates a comfortable narrative. This system worked. It worked brilliantly. The Wehrmacht of 1939 to 1941 was perhaps the finest battlefield instrument in human history at that particular tactical level, the level of the company, the battalion, the regiment. The men executed with speed and precision that their enemies simply couldn't match. In Poland, 4 weeks to total victory. In France, 6 weeks to the total destruction of an army that had spent 20 years building what they called the greatest defensive system in Europe. The Maginot Line, the British Expeditionary Force, the entire French General Staff's plan for defending civilization. All of it swept away in 42 days by men who obeyed their orders with mechanical precision and officers who had been trained to think 2 levels above their rank. German military intelligence after the fall of France referred to the American military as Britain's Italians. They meant a nation with numbers, factories, enthusiasm, and a complete inability to translate any of those things into soldiers. The joke made the rounds in the officer corps. America would provide the quantity of incompetence that Italy was providing to the Axis cause. Now, there is one more piece to this picture. One piece that the German captain watching American soldiers argue in that French field doesn't yet understand. Because Prussian obedience had a ceiling. It was built into the design from the beginning, and it had nothing to do with the Americans. It had to do with what happens when the man at the top of the chain of command is wrong. In a system where soldiers don't argue, where every order flows down and every man executes without question, the entire machine runs on the quality of the decisions being made at the top. The obedient soldier is only as good as the commander he obeys. And in August 1934, every soldier in the Wehrmacht swore a personal oath. Not to Germany, not to the Constitution, to a man. The oath read, "I swear by God this sacred oath to the leader of the German Empire and people, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, I shall render unconditional obedience. 300 years of Prussian military culture, 16 weeks of drilling obedience into men's bones, an oath to a single individual, concentrated into a system that moved like a perfect machine. But what no one asked was, what happens when the machine gets bad orders? The answer to that question is why the German captain in France is watching American soldiers argue with their sergeant in 1944. But before we get to France, we need to understand something that German intelligence completely failed to anticipate. They knew American industry. They'd seen the production numbers. They knew about the draft and the millions of men. What they did not understand, what they genuinely could not process, was the raw material those draft notices were pulling into uniform. Because the man who argues with his sergeant at a map table in France in 1944 was, 2 years ago, a truck driver in Indiana, a hardware store clerk in Ohio, a high school teacher in Iowa, and those men brought something into uniform that no Prussian military tradition had ever tried to weaponize. They brought democratic habits of mind. Part 2. The Mob That Fought. Citizen Soldiers and the Culture of Argument. Spring 1919. The Great War is over. American intelligence officers, working through mountains of intercepted letters, interrogation transcripts, and reports from German prisoners, compile a document. They title it Candid Comment on the American Soldier of 1917 to 1918 and Kindred Topics by the Germans. It is 84 pages long, and it is one of the most fascinating documents in military history. The Germans are trying to understand what they just fought, because what they found on the Western Front in the final months of the war was something they hadn't expected, something that didn't fit their model, and some of them wrote about it with striking honesty. A German veteran writing about American prisoners, the Americans were what might be called bad prisoners. A group of 14 were brought in one day and, when asked about their units, refused to talk. They refused to work and talked back to the officers, much to the annoyance of the officers and the concealed delight of the men. Read that carefully. It's not just that they talked back. It's the concealed delight of the other German soldiers watching it happen. Because somewhere in the German enlisted ranks, there was a man who wanted to talk back, who wanted to refuse to work for his captors, but couldn't, because the habit of obedience had been drilled too deep. Another German officer. The American army seems to me as fine a collection of individual physical specimens as I have ever seen, but from the standpoint of military discipline, it is a mob, pure and simple. The men appear slouchy. The officers do not stand out from the men in appearance as they do in any European army. And then, from a different observer, something that reads almost like an accidental admission. The attitude of the American officer towards enlisted men is very different than in our army, in which officers have always treated their men as cattle. There it is, written in 1919 by a German observer who meant it as criticism. Officers who treat men as equals, not cattle. NCOs who can be questioned, a hierarchy that must be earned rather than simply accepted. Now, here's the thing that the German officer calling Americans a mob completely failed to process. A mob is unpredictable because no one is in charge. What he was actually watching was something different. It was an army where everyone was, in some sense, partially in charge, where initiative was not punished, where a private could point at a map and say, "That road will get us killed," and be heard. This didn't happen by design, not at first. It happened because the United States had no professional army to speak of when the war started. In 1940, the U.S. Army was the 17th largest in the world, roughly the same size as Portugal's. They had 174,000 soldiers. The Wehrmacht had millions. What America did have was 16 million men who were drafted or volunteered between 1941 and 1945, 16 million civilians, farmers from Kansas, factory workers from Detroit, lawyers from New York, college kids from Texas. These men came in carrying something no military training could fully strip away: the habits of democratic citizenship. In a democracy, you argue, you question authority, you ask why, you expect explanations, you hold the right to disagree. These habits drove the regular army insane at first. Samuel Stauffer, the sociologist the army hired to survey 500,000 soldiers during the war, documented page after page of what he called the citizen soldier problem. Men who defined themselves as temporary soldiers, who chafed against the army's traditions, social stratification, authoritarianism, and hidebound caste culture. Men who wanted a reason before they would die for a plan. One enlistee from the 9th Division wrote, just after Pearl Harbor, "We are a democratic race, bred, born, and raised by the freedom of a democracy." How can anyone expect to erase all this by 1 year of severe training? He was asking a genuine question, and the answer, which the American military found only through experience and often through catastrophic failure, was, you don't erase it, you use it. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because while the democratic habits of mind were the raw material of something extraordinary, they didn't automatically produce a fighting force. Far from it. The same individualism that made American soldiers argue at map tables also made them terrible candidates for the parade ground discipline that European armies used to build cohesion. The U.S. Army of 1941 and 1942 was a mess, not in the equipment sense. The factories were running. In the human sense, units that had never trained together going into combat against professionals, officers who had their authority questioned and didn't know how to handle it, NCOs who hadn't figured out yet that their rank wasn't going to automatically silence a truck driver from Indiana who thought the plan was wrong. There's a story from Kasserine Pass, February 1943. That illustrates this exactly. The disaster happened for many reasons. bad intelligence, worse planning, a headquarters 70 miles behind the front, commanders communicating in a private code their own staff couldn't decipher. But underneath all of that was a cultural problem. The Army hadn't figured out yet how to take democratic instincts and shape them into something that functioned in combat. A junior officer who didn't command respect had two options. He could try to impose authority by rank, and in an army of citizen soldiers who'd spent their whole lives in workplaces where authority had to be earned, that rarely worked, or he could earn it. But there was no system for earning it, no doctrine that said, here is how a 21-year-old with lieutenant's bars on his shoulders walks into a platoon of combat veterans and gets them to follow him into fire. So for most of 1942 and early 1943, the Army kind of improvised, and the improvisation was ugly. But there is a fact, a single fact from a post-war survey, that explains everything about what the American system eventually became and why the German captain watching soldiers argue at a map had completely misread what he was seeing. Stauffer's researchers asked a group of American combat veterans, pick out some man who you would say was one of the best combat soldiers you have known. Only 10% selected a commissioned officer, a CO, a lieutenant or captain. 55% selected an NCO, a sergeant. 34% selected a private or private first class. Let me put that in perspective. In the German Wehrmacht, nearly all company-grade officers were regarded as brave, efficient, and worthy of trust throughout most of the war. That was the foundation. Competent officers, obedient men. The officer was the system. In the American Army, the sergeant was the system, and nobody had planned it that way. Not exactly. It grew organically from the collision between democratic habits and military necessity. The NCO, the non-commissioned officer, became the figure who bridged those worlds. He'd been enlisted. He'd been a private. He knew what a truck driver from Indiana actually thought and needed, and he also understood the mission, the tactics, the reason behind the order. He was the man who could explain the plan to someone who was going to argue about it. And when the plan was argued about, he was the man who could tell the difference between an argument born of cowardice and an argument born of genuine tactical intelligence. The 1919 German report called American soldiers bad prisoners for talking back to officers. By 1944, the U.S. Army had figured out how to weaponize that same tendency. Consider Private Harold Kiner of the 101st Airborne Division, 20 years old. Before the war, he'd worked at a Woolworth's in Akron, Ohio, stocking shelves. In October 1944, during fighting in Holland, his squad was pinned down and his platoon sergeant was hit. No officer was within calling distance. Kiner didn't wait. He assessed, maneuvered two other men into flanking positions, and suppressed the German position long enough for the rest of his squad to pull the sergeant to cover. He received no special commendation for it. He was simply a private who had grown up in a country where, if you saw a problem and could fix it, you didn't stand there waiting for someone with more authority to show up. German military culture literally had no framework for this. The private who acted without orders wasn't a hero in the Prussian system. He was a disciplinary problem. But the American system had built, without entirely meaning to, a culture where the private's initiative was expected, where acting without orders wasn't disobedience, it was competence. Men like Harold Kiner fought not for glory and not because the manual told them to. They fought because their culture had taught them that when something needs doing, you do it. Every like on this video keeps that story, and thousands like it, visible a little longer, and that matters. Part 3. When the system broke, and how they fixed it faster than anyone thought possible. February 14th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. General Lloyd Fredendall commands the U.S. Second Corps from his headquarters in a ravine, 70 miles behind the front lines. 70 miles. He communicates with his division commanders in a personal code so idiosyncratic that his own staff officers spent hours trying to decipher it. He's never visited the front. On paper, he commands a corps. In practice, he's managing a radio from a cave. Rommel's Africa Corps hits the American positions at 0430 and rolls through them like they aren't there. In 5 days, The Second Corps is driven back more than 50 miles. Losses: 6,500 men, 183 tanks destroyed, 208 artillery pieces abandoned, 500 trucks scattered across the desert. Roughly 20% of the engaged force ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The German after-action assessment was clinical and damning. American equipment moved forward without infantry coordination. American infantry attacked in parade ground formations, left over from training manuals that bore no relationship to what Rommel's veterans were doing across the line. There was no combined arms integration. There was no reconnaissance. There was no flexibility. And here's the thing that gets missed in every popular account of Kasserine Pass. The Americans who were there were not cowards. The individual soldiers, the sergeants, the junior officers, the ones who could actually see what was happening, many of them knew the plan was wrong. They could see it. The approach roads were channeled. The defensive positions were wrong. The timing made no sense. But the culture hadn't yet developed a mechanism for that knowledge to travel upward. The habit of democratic argument, which would save American lives later, hadn't yet been integrated with military discipline. The result was two simultaneous failures. Officers who couldn't lead because they hadn't earned the trust to be argued with productively, and soldiers who had the right instincts but no sanctioned way to act on them. Fredendall was removed from command on March 6, 1943. His replacement was George S. Patton. Patton had 17 days. Think about that number. 17 days to transform a shattered corps before the Germans attacked again. Same men, same equipment, same enemy. March 23, 1943. El Ghoutar, Tunisia. The 10th Panzer Division, the same formation that had helped rout American forces 6 weeks earlier, attacks with 50 of its 57 available tanks down a valley toward what they expect to be the disorganized wreckage of an American corps. What they find instead is a kill zone. Tank destroyers in concealed positions on the valley walls, artillery pre-registered on every approach route. A minefield that stalls 8 tanks in the opening minutes, compressing the following vehicles into a formation with no room to maneuver. When the American guns open from 3 directions simultaneously, the Germans can't identify a single firing position. In the single engagement, the 10th Panzer loses more than 30 tanks. Rommel wrote in private papers recovered after the war that American commanders had absorbed the lessons of mobile warfare with remarkable speed. The same army he'd scattered 6 weeks earlier was fighting back with systematic precision. But here is what actually changed in those 17 days, and it is not what you think. It wasn't Patton's inspirational speeches. It wasn't some massive tactical overhaul. What changed was simpler and more fundamental. Patton visited the front. He went to the units. He walked the ground. He talked to the sergeants. In a German corps, the general doesn't visit the sergeants. The chain of command flows from top to bottom with the efficient impersonality of a telegram. Patton did something that would have baffled a Prussian officer. He went to find out what the men who were actually fighting knew that headquarters didn't. And what he found, documented in the after-action reports, was that sergeants and junior officers had detailed and accurate knowledge of the terrain, the German tactics, the failures of the previous weeks. They had argued about these things among themselves. They'd had informal discussions that would have looked to a German officer exactly like the mob mentality of undisciplined soldiers questioning authority. Patton looked at that arguing and saw something completely different. He saw intelligence. He saw the system telling him what it needed, and he used it. Now, here is where the German Auftragstaktik comparison becomes genuinely important, and also genuinely complicated. The German system, at its best, did something extraordinary. It pushed decision-making authority down to the company level, the platoon level, even lower. Commanders were trained to operate 2 levels above their rank. A platoon commander knew how to run a battalion if needed. This was called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. The commander gives the objective and the reason. The subordinate chooses the method. This is, on paper, a form of institutionalized arguing, permission to deviate from orders if the situation demands it, the freedom to think. But there's a catch, a fundamental structural catch that historians who admire Auftragstaktik often skip. Auftragstaktik was a doctrine for officers. It required years of training, cross-posting between branches, exercises at multiple echelon levels. It was built for a professional corps that had been cultivated over decades. And even within that professional corps, the Auftragstaktik doctrine was being systematically strangled from the top, first by Halder, then by Hitler, precisely because the men at the top of the German military chain couldn't tolerate the inevitable result of a system that taught independent judgment, subordinates who used it. The American system had something Auftragstaktik was always designed to produce but kept failing to deliver. Commanders who had actually, organically, culturally learned to listen, not because doctrine told them to, because the men they were leading would argue with them if they didn't. One post-war study put it this way: the American system was not designed to be democratic, but the men in it were, and the system evolved to accommodate them, and in doing so, it created something that doctrine alone never could. A sergeant named Curtis Grubb Cullen Jr., 30 years old, had sold whiskey before the war. He had no engineering background. In the summer of 1944, in the bocage of Normandy, he was staring at a problem that was paralyzing an entire army group: the hedgerows. 4-foot earthen banks topped with 15-foot vegetation, root systems 12 feet deep. Every time a Sherman tank tried to climb one, it exposed its belly, the thinnest armor on the vehicle, to German anti-tank teams positioned on the other side. The Allied advance had slowed to a mile a day at catastrophic cost. Cullen was in a brainstorming session. A soldier from Tennessee named Roberts made a suggestion. What if you put saw teeth in the front of the tank and cut through the hedge instead of climbing over it? Most of the room laughed. Cullen didn't. He fashioned a steel plow from captured German beach obstacles, Czech hedgehogs, the X-shaped anti-invasion barriers from the beaches of Normandy. He welded them onto a Sherman. On July 14th, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watched the demonstration. The tank accelerated, hit the hedgerow, and drove through it. Not over it, through it. In 11 days, 500 Rhino devices were manufactured and installed. 3 out of 5 tanks in First Army carried the modification by Operation Cobra. This could not have happened in a German corps, not because German soldiers were less inventive. It could not have happened because in a system built on Befehlstaktik, order-based tactics, compliance with the established plan, a sergeant with a welding torch does not present a solution to a general. He waits for a directive from above. And the directive, if it comes at all, comes in weeks, not days. Cullen received the Legion of Merit. 4 months later, he lost a leg to a landmine in the Hurtgen forest. He went home, returned to selling whiskey, and died in 1963 at 48 years old. His name appears in almost no popular histories of the war, but his Rhino device enabled Operation Cobra, and Cobra broke the German army in the West. The American system had been arguing with itself since Kasserine, and what it was building through that argument, through the friction and the feedback loops and the democratic stubbornness, was institutional learning, faster, messier, and ultimately more lethal than anything the Prussian tradition had produced. But there is a counter-argument to this story, and it deserves to be heard. Because the American system was not uniformly better, it had a failure mode that cost an enormous number of lives, and the Germans found it. Part 4. The Dark Side. What the arguing cost and what it saved. Here's a fact that doesn't fit the comfortable narrative. By every statistical measure, the German infantry soldier was more effective, man for man, than his American counterpart throughout much of the war. Military historians have confirmed what the combat records had always suggested. German units consistently inflicted roughly 50% more casualties than they sustained across both Eastern and Western fronts, in engagements where the comparative quality of equipment was roughly equal. The German system produced individual soldiers of extraordinary tactical competence. The cross-training, the NCO education system that had been built over decades, the emphasis on small unit cohesion, it made extraordinary infantrymen. The American replacement system, by contrast, was brutal in a specific way. A man who survived combat was kept on the front line indefinitely. He was not rotated back to rest and refit. German divisions were regularly pulled from the line for reconstitution. American soldiers in Europe had to fight until they were dead. wounded, or what the Army politely called a psychiatric casualty. The accumulated exhaustion of this policy showed in combat performance, particularly in 1944 when the replacement pipeline was running cold. Captain Charles MacDonald, 21 years old, a replacement commander joining the Veteran Company I after their brutal fight through Normandy, wrote about it with painful honesty. He arrived wearing lieutenant's bars and was met by soldiers who had stormed the beach on D-Day +1. "If only I knew what combat was like," he wrote. It seemed incredible that this group of hardened combat veterans could accept an inexperienced youth of 21 to lead them into battle simply because he happened to come to them wearing a set of flashy bars on his shoulders. They didn't accept him. Not automatically. He had to earn it. And here's the point that connects directly back to the question in our title. The German captain in France thought American soldiers arguing with officers was weakness. What he'd actually identified was a quality control mechanism. The arguing was the test. In a German unit, a new officer walked in with his rank and was obeyed. Full stop. The system didn't question him because the system didn't allow it, which meant a bad officer could stay in command for a very long time because no one around him would tell him he was wrong. In an American unit, a new officer walked in and had to prove himself. The sergeants would give him limited trust and watch what he did with it. The privates would grumble and argue and push back on orders that seemed wrong. And if the officer listened, adapted, and showed genuine competence, he earned something no rank insignia could confer: real authority. This system was infuriating for the officers who didn't understand it. It was efficient and lethal for the ones who did. Now consider what happened on the morning of June 6, 1944. The night before, Hitler had been awake late. He'd finally gone to bed somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning. By 6 a.m., American paratroopers had been on the ground for hours. The 82nd and 101st Airborne were scattered across the Normandy countryside. The invasion was clearly, undeniably underway. And the Panzer Reserves, the armored forces that Field Marshal Rommel had positioned specifically to counterattack any beachhead in its first vulnerable hours, sat still. They sat still because they required Hitler's personal authorization to move, and Hitler was asleep. And no one in the German command structure was willing to wake the Führer without authorization, and no one was willing to release the Panzers without the Führer's personal order. Rommel himself was in Germany for his wife's birthday. His deputy commanders were afraid to act. General Erich Marx of the 84th Corps was one of the first senior German officers to grasp the full scale of what was happening. He was at a map exercise, rehearsing defense scenarios, when the first reports came in. He immediately grasped that this was the invasion. He called up the chain of command for authorization to move the reserves. He was told to wait. The decision had to come from the top. By the time Hitler woke up, was briefed, issued authorization, and the panzers were moving, it was early afternoon. The critical window, the hours when a determined armored counterattack could have driven the Allies back into the sea, was gone. Here, the German military system's centuries of obedience killed Germany's last chance to win the war in the West. The commanders on the ground knew what was happening. Some of them were screaming into phones demanding authorization to move. But the system, the same system that produced perfect panzer execution in France in 1940, required the man at the top to give the order. And the man at the top was asleep. Now imagine a U.S. Army colonel in the same situation. His superior is unavailable. The window is closing. The mission is clear. What does he do? He moves. Because the American military had, through 4 years of democratic argument, trial, error, and the unending friction of citizen soldiers who would not simply be told what to do, built a culture where initiative was expected, where a commander on the ground was supposed to use his judgment, where waiting for orders when action was possible was not caution. It was a failure of command. There is a moment at Bastogne, December 22, 1944, that crystallizes this difference with almost theatrical clarity. The 101st Airborne is surrounded. The German 47th Panzer Corps sends 2 officers forward under white flags with a formal written demand: surrender or face annihilation. The document is composed with the careful language of Prussian military tradition. It invokes superior force, the humane desire to spare unnecessary bloodshed, and the honor of both armies. It is the product of a military culture that believed commands, even ultimatums, followed a proper form. The American commanding general, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, was at his headquarters when the note arrived. He read it. He looked up and said with genuine surprise, "A surrender? Aw, nuts." He put the paper down, went back to congratulating a unit that had destroyed a German roadblock that morning. When he was later asked to compose an official written reply, his staff reminded him what he'd initially said. Someone suggested it would be hard to beat, so McAuliffe typed his reply on a single sheet of paper and sent it back to the German officers under the white flag. It consisted of one word: nuts. The German officers, handed the single-page reply, were baffled. They asked what it meant. An American colonel named Harper told them it meant exactly what it sounded like: go to hell. Then he added, "If you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into the city." The German major, a product of a military culture where formal ultimatums received formal responses, stormed away furious and bewildered. The informality itself was an insult he hadn't anticipated. In Prussian military tradition, one acknowledged superior firepower. One followed the protocol of surrender. One did not tell a German corps commander to go to hell with a single-word note. To the Americans, it wasn't rudeness, it was clarity. If your father or grandfather served in any branch of the armed forces during this war, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. What unit? What theater? What did they see that no history book ever recorded? Those specific details are irreplaceable. They are the actual record. They deserve to be preserved by the families who carry them. Part 5. The Verdict. Why the Mob Won the War. November 1945. Somewhere in occupied Germany, a former Wehrmacht general sits across a table from an American interrogator. He is not young. He has fought in France, on the Eastern Front, in the West. He has commanded formations that, man for man and unit for unit, were among the finest combat organizations in history. And now he is trying to explain to an American colonel why they lost. He talks about air power. He talks about logistics. He talks about the scale of American industrial production. He talks about two fronts, about fuel shortages, about Hitler's interference with operational planning. And then the interrogator asks what the German high command thought of American soldiers. Not American machines, not American air power, American soldiers, the men. The general is quiet for a moment, and then he says something that he would never have said in 1943. He says, "Enthusiastic amateurs with the disposition to aggression I had never seen in any other nation's sons." And he adds something that the transcript preserves almost as an afterthought. He says that what surprised him most about fighting Americans was how they reacted to being attacked. Every other Allied force he had fought, he said, would return fire and edge toward a better position. Americans would return fire, and then bring the entire weight of fire support down on whatever they were fighting, and then counterattack the moment the fire lifted. No pause to consult higher command, no waiting for authorization, just fire, call for support, push forward. That is not the response of an army built on obedience. That is the response of an army built on initiative, on men who have been trusted to decide, on sergeants who argued with maps and privates who questioned plans and officers who had to earn their authority rather than inherit it from their rank. Let's be precise about what actually happened between 1941 and 1945. The United States started with a 17th ranked army. It fielded 16 million men. Of those men, the overwhelming majority had never served a day in uniform before Pearl Harbor. They came in arguing, questioning, pushing back against every regulation that didn't make sense to them. They violated fraternization orders with cheerful creativity. They complained about the food. They wrote letters home criticizing their officers. They took surveys where, given the choice, they pointed to the NCO, the sergeant, as the best soldier they'd known, not the commissioned officer. This drove military traditionalists insane. It looked like chaos. It looked like exactly what the German captain watching the map argument called it, a mob, but the same qualities that made American soldiers bad prisoners, who talked back to their captors, who refused to work when ordered, who maintained their democratic habits even behind German wire. Those qualities made them soldiers who would not wait to be told to act when acting was clearly necessary, who would adjust on the fly without authorization, who would solve a hedgerow problem with a welding torch when no engineer with the proper credentials had thought of it, who would argue with the plan until the plan was right, and then execute the right plan with everything they had. Here is the final fact that ties this together. In those critical hours of June 6, 1944, when the panzers sat still because Hitler was asleep, American soldiers were already making decisions. All across Normandy, in ditches and hedgerows and flooded fields, in the dark and the cold and the chaos of a scattered jump, paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne were improvising. They had landed miles from their drop zones. Their units were scattered. Their officers were often dead or missing. Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th PYR, 101st Airborne, landed in the dark near Sainte-Mère-Église. His company was scattered across miles of Normandy. He assembled the men he could find, a mix of soldiers from different units, and within hours was attacking German gun positions that were destroying Allied troops on Utah Beach. He had no orders to do this, no authorization from above. He assessed, decided, and acted, because that is what he had been trained to do, not by a manual that said act without orders, but by a culture that said the man on the ground with the best information is the one who decides. Sergeant Myron Ranney of the same division landed alone, found men from 3 different units he'd never met, assembled them into a force, and took his objective without a single person with direct authority over him telling him to. Nobody ordered him to do it. Nobody could have. He'd been trained, not in formal doctrine, but by a culture that said, you know the mission, you see the situation, you act. And one more. Private Kenneth Moore of the 82nd Airborne, 19 years old, from Muscle Shoals, Alabama. He landed in a flooded field near Saint-Martin-de-Varville, alone, with only a knife and a .45 pistol. His rifle had been lost in the jump. He spent the next 6 hours linking up with other paratroopers and capturing a German communications post, improvising throughout with no communication to any higher command. After the war, he went home to Alabama and got a job at a utility company. He never wrote a memoir. His story survives only in unit records and the recollections of the men who were there. These men shared one thing. They had argued. Maybe not with a general, maybe not at a map table, but in training, in the barracks, in the mess halls, at every level of the informal American military culture. They had grown up in units where questioning the plan was expected, where a private could say, that doesn't seem right, and have it heard. And that habit, the democratic habit of questioning, had built inside them something the Prussian system could not manufacture,